An old man walked into the courtroom handcuffed, silent, and wrapped in an oversized military coat that swallowed his frame. No one knew his name. No one cared. He was just another homeless man on trial, for trying to stay warm behind a diner vent. But minutes later, that same courtroom would rise to their feet saluting him. Because what they didn't know, was that the man they were about to convict had once saved an entire platoon under enemy fire in Fallujah. This is the story of a forgotten war hero rediscovered in the most unexpected place. Stay with us till the end because what unfolds next, will change how you see honor, justice, and the price of silence. The door to courtroom 3B creaked open as the bailiff called out, "All rise." A hush fell over the modest courthouse in Springfield, Missouri. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The scent of varnished oak and old carpet filled the air. An elderly man shuffled in, his hands cuffed in front of him, the dull metal gleaming under the overhead lights. He wore an old, oversized army green field coat, the fabric frayed at the collar and sleeves. His boots, scuffed and worn to the sole, scraped softly against the linoleum floor as he walked. He didn't lift his eyes. His hair was thin and gray, his beard unshaved. But the weight he carried, one could feel it pressing into the room. "State your name for the record," the clerk said without looking up. The man spoke softly, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "Samuel T. Morgan. Staff Sergeant. United States Army." His words seemed to echo louder than they should have, drawing brief glances from the people in the courtroom. There was something in his tone, not shame, not arrogance, but something like quiet exhaustion wrapped in dignity. He took a seat on the defendant's bench, slouching as if gravity had grown heavier with age. The coat he wore nearly swallowed his shoulders. A faint thread of military patches was still visible on one arm, though too faded to read. He sat motionless, waiting. His face, lined with the deep etchings of hardship and time, looked forward blankly. Behind the bench sat Judge Marlene Whitaker, early 50s, composed, with silver strands blending into her tightly pulled-back auburn hair. She flipped through the case file for a moment, fingers pausing suddenly on one page. Her eyes scanned a line, then widened slightly. Her hand stilled. Morgan. Her skin paled ever so slightly. That name. No, it couldn't be. But then a memory sparked like a flare in her mind. A photograph. A letter. A day she had tried to forget and never could. She took a slow breath, shut the file, and looked down at the frail figure below. The bailiff called out the case. Case number 72A, City of Springfield vs. Samuel Morgan. Charges, loitering, trespassing, and resisting arrest. Samuel didn't flinch. He simply waited, elbows resting lightly on his knees. The prosecutor stood, a young man in a crisp gray suit with a bright red tie that looked a little too eager for his own good. Assistant DA Brandon Yates. His voice was polished, but it had the flat cadence of someone reading from a practiced script. "Your Honor," Yates began, "the defendant has received multiple warnings for loitering behind Roosevelt Diner. The owner has filed 3 separate complaints this month alone. Mr. Morgan was found again at approximately 11:47 p.m. last Thursday, sitting near the kitchen vent. When ordered to vacate, he resisted, resulting in his arrest." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly but said nothing. What Yates didn't say, what no one in the courtroom yet knew, was the truth behind those details. Samuel hadn't begged. He didn't panhandle. He wasn't harassing anyone. He simply sat outside the diner on winter nights, tucked beside the alley vent where warm air leaked from the kitchen. Just trying to stay warm when temperatures dipped below 30 degrees. That night, he had been eating half of a leftover sandwich, one that Jimmy, the line cook who had known him since childhood, had slipped him out of view. Samuel had asked the officer politely just 5 more minutes to finish eating. But the officer hadn't listened. No one really had. Now, in front of a judge, Samuel sat accused once again of being a nuisance. A problem to be cleaned off the streets like a stain. The prosecutor kept speaking. This is Mr. Morgan's third citation this year. We recommend 30 days of community service and a no trespass order covering all of downtown Springfield. Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. A no trespass order would include the Jefferson shelter? Yes, Your Honor, Yates confirmed. And the Salvation Mission Church. So, she said slowly, you're recommending an order that would effectively bar the defendant from every source of food or warmth available to him this winter. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Samuel shifted slightly in his seat. Mr. Morgan, Judge Whitaker finally addressed him directly. Do you have legal representation with you today? He shook his head. No, ma'am. My lawyer got called into another courtroom. She peered at him over the rim of her glasses. Would you like to speak for yourself? He cleared his throat. No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm. That alley vent, it's all I had. Jimmy the cook, he leaves me food sometimes. Known him since he was a kid. His daddy served with me. Desert Storm. Desert Storm? Judge Whitaker asked, pausing from her notes. You served? Yes, ma'am. United States Army. 1978 through 02. Staff Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 75th Rangers. Iraq. Kuwait. Bosnia. His voice was soft but unwavering now. There was something in the way he said it, not boastful, just factual. He had said those words before, long ago, in debriefings, roll calls, hospitals. It was part of him, though buried. Judge Whitaker stared at the man in front of her. A strange ache pulled behind her eyes. There was something familiar. She opened her mouth to respond, but the back doors to the courtroom suddenly swung open. A sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit strode in with swift, purposeful steps. He looked like someone who didn't belong in this room but walked like someone who knew he did. He carried a slim briefcase and went straight to the defense table. He placed the case down, turned toward the judge, and spoke with confidence. Your Honor, Ethan Caldwell. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Morgan. Samuel blinked, confused. I don't know him, he muttered. Judge Whitaker frowned. This is highly irregular, Mr. Caldwell. The court was not informed of any change in representation. I understand, Your Honor, Caldwell said calmly. It's a last-minute development. I respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client. Whitaker hesitated, her lips pressed tightly. She studied both men for a long moment, especially Samuel, who still looked like he had no idea what was going on. This court will recess for 15 minutes, she finally said, rising from the bench and stepping into her chambers. As the door shut behind her, Samuel leaned toward the stranger beside him. I don't got money for a lawyer like you. You won't need it, Ethan replied softly. My firm is taking this case pro bono. Samuel looked at him closely. Why? Caldwell hesitated, then answered, because someone who matters asked me to. Inside her office, Judge Whitaker stood in front of her bookshelf, hands trembling. She removed her glasses, staring down at the file she had carried with her. Samuel Morgan. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a photo frame wrapped in an old army scarf. In the photo, a young soldier grinned beside a woman in a graduation cap, her younger self. Her brother, Captain Thomas Whitaker, had been killed outside Fallujah in 2004. In his last letter home, he had written of a sergeant who had saved him once before. He never said much. Just. If I don't make it back, remember the man who pulled me from the fire. Sergeant Morgan. He didn't just save my life. He reminded me why we serve. She had never forgotten that name. Samuel Morgan. For years after Tom's death, she had tried to locate the man. But the army had said he'd redeployed. Later, they said he'd been discharged with PTSD. Then nothing. Now, 20 years later, he had walked into her courtroom. And no one recognized him except her. She pressed her hand to her heart, then picked up the phone. "Major Daniels," she said. "It's Judge Marlene Whitaker. I need a favor. And I need it now." Outside, in the empty courtroom, Ethan Caldwell leaned in again. "I want to be clear, Mr. Morgan. We're not just trying to reduce a charge. We're going to make things right. All of them." Samuel looked at him, skeptical. "I've been out here 20 years. Ain't nobody made things right yet." Caldwell smiled faintly. "Then maybe today's the day." The walls of Judge Marlene Whitaker's chambers were lined with law books and commendations, but at this moment, all she could see was the faded edge of a photograph. The picture was old, taken in 1999, back when her brother, Captain Thomas Whitaker, had graduated from Ranger School. He was standing tall in full dress uniform, one arm thrown proudly over her shoulder, beaming like he had the world ahead of him. She had just passed the bar exam, and they'd celebrated together. She'd been so sure back then of the law, of justice, of what she believed was fair. But that was before Fallujah. Before the IED. Before the letters stopped. Now, 2 decades later, the man her brother had written about had walked into her courtroom in rags, handcuffed, and accused of loitering. His name wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded her brother's final letter again, the paper thin from years of grief-fueled rereading. "The enemy ambushed our convoy 2 days ago. We were pinned, no cover, no exit. It was bad, Marlene. Real bad. I thought I was done. Then out of nowhere, Sergeant Morgan appears. Took rounds through the shoulder and still pulled me out of the blast zone. Ordered everyone else to fall back while he laid down cover fire. I owe him my life." She stared at those last words. "I owe him my life." She whispered them aloud like a vow. Just then, a knock came at her door. "Enter," she called. The door cracked open and Ethan Caldwell stepped in, closing it behind him. His suit was impeccable as always, but his eyes held concern. "Marlene," he said, dropping the formalities. Only a few people still called her by name. "What is this?" he asked. "You looked like you'd seen a ghost." She held out the photo. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes scanning it, then looked up at her. "Your brother." "Yes," she said, voice tight. "You remember what happened, don't you?" "I was at the funeral," Ethan replied. "He was a hero." She nodded, then handed him the letter. "Read the name," she said. Ethan's brow furrowed as he read. When he reached the bottom, he looked up, stunned. "Sergeant Morgan." She nodded. "That's the man in the courtroom?" "It is." He blinked, processing. "But the army said he vanished." "He redeployed," she said. "Then he disappeared into red tape. PTSD. No follow-up. No support." Ethan sat heavily on a nearby chair. "You've been searching for him ever since." She nodded again. "I didn't even know he was still alive." Ethan rubbed his chin. "So what happens now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I won't let this courtroom strip the dignity from a man who gave everything to save my brother. I won't." Ethan leaned forward. "You could recuse yourself." "No," she said firmly. "I'm not stepping back. I'm stepping up. If there's any justice left in this country, we give it to men like him." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marlene picked up the phone again. "Colonel Hastings, this is Judge Whitaker. I need confirmation on a veteran." "Yes." Staff Sergeant Samuel T. Morgan. Service dates, 1978 to 2002. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Request full file. I need it sent within the hour. Back in the courtroom, Samuel sat silently, his hands folded in his lap. The courtroom was half empty now, the noon recess scattering those who weren't emotionally invested. But a few had remained: an older woman from the church pantry, a young barista who'd served Samuel warm coffee on freezing mornings, and a city journalist quietly observing from the rear pew, pen twitching between her fingers. Ethan returned, sitting beside his client. "Listen, Sam," he said, voice low. "The judge, she knows who you are." "I don't know her," Samuel replied. "But she knows you," Ethan said, tapping the letter he now held. "You saved her brother." Samuel blinked. "Tom. You remember?" "I never forgot," Samuel whispered. "Captain Whitaker. Took shrapnel during that ambush. Kept trying to push me away so I'd save the others. He was brave." Ethan leaned in. "You carried him back under fire." "I carried a lot of men," Samuel said quietly. "Not all of them made it." "This isn't about guilt," Ethan replied. "This is about honor. They buried your story. I think today's the day we unbury it." Samuel didn't respond. He just looked at the courtroom doors. When the recess ended, Judge Whitaker returned to the bench. But something had changed. She carried no files, no glasses. Her robe remained, but her demeanor was more than legal formality now. It was personal resolve tempered by years of sorrow. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, addressing the room, "has your client made a decision?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said, standing. "We are requesting dismissal of all charges." Mr. Morgan wasn't trespassing, he was trying to survive below freezing temperatures. In fact, the diner employees had, on multiple occasions, permitted his presence after hours. This constitutes implied permission. The prosecutor rose to object, but Judge Whitaker held up a hand. "Before we debate," she said sharply, "I have questions for the defendant." She turned to Samuel, locking eyes with him for the first time. "Mr. Morgan. Your military record includes Fallujah. April 2004. "Yes, ma'am." "Were you present for Operation Iron Resolve, near the southern edge of the city?" Samuel's eyebrows lifted. "Yes, ma'am. We were running supply to an armored convoy when things went sideways." "During that engagement," she continued, "did you assist in the extraction of a wounded officer?" "Captain Thomas Whitaker." The room froze. Even the humming lights seemed to quiet. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. "Captain Whitaker, yeah. He was trying to drag another man when he got clipped. I pulled him out while he was yelling at me to leave him behind. Stubborn bastard." She exhaled, a tremor in her hand as she gripped the bench. "And what happened after?" "We got him on the evac chopper," Samuel replied. "He made it out. But weeks later, convoy hit an IED. I heard through command. Always wondered if saving him just delayed the end." The courtroom was silent. In the gallery, a man in a faded army jacket stood slowly. "I was there," he said in a voice that carried. Everyone turned. "I was in that convoy. He saved us all. Without Morgan, we wouldn't have made it out." The judge looked at him. "Please identify yourself." "Master Sergeant Harold L. Crane, retired. I served with Sergeant Morgan during Desert Storm and Fallujah. I can testify under oath that what he did wasn't just heroism, it was madness. Brave, stupid, beautiful madness." Judge Whitaker blinked back tears. "Thank you, Sergeant Crane." The prosecutor stood, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, while I respect Mr. Morgan's military service, I must insist that it bears no legal relevance to the present charges." Judge Whitaker turned to him with sharp authority. "This court disagrees. It is deeply relevant." She placed her gavel down softly but firmly. "This court will recess for 10 minutes. Then, for a moment, something rare." She looked directly into Samuel's eyes, not as a judge to a defendant, but as a sister to a savior. Mr. Morgan, she said, voice softer now, when I return, we'll be discussing matters that go far beyond loitering charges. Then she stepped down from the bench. The second recess had ended, but the air in the courtroom hadn't cleared. It had only thickened with memory, uncertainty, and something else, reverence. When Judge Marlene Whitaker returned to the bench, she was not alone. 3 figures followed behind her, each in crisp, formal military attire, a full colonel with silver trim on his shoulders, a quiet master sergeant with steady eyes, and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case that gleamed under the courtroom lights. The murmurs in the gallery began even before they reached the bench. Some people stood. Others only stared. And at the defense table, Samuel Morgan slowly rose to his feet. He didn't need prompting. He didn't need to be told who they were or what they represented. Old instincts took over. The man who had entered in shackles now stood at attention. His joints ached. His body protested. But he stood straighter than he had in years. His boots found the floor like they used to, his shoulders squared as though they had remembered the burden of command and dignity. Judge Whitaker took her seat, but did not reach for her gavel. Instead, she removed her glasses and set them aside. There were no rules left to hide behind. Not today. Before we proceed, she said, her voice carrying with a new clarity, I must disclose a personal connection to this case. A breathless pause stretched through the room. Then she looked directly at Samuel, and the moment froze in place. The Captain Thomas Whitaker mentioned earlier, she said, her voice strong but colored with a grief held tight for decades, was my brother. Gasps broke out across the gallery. Samuel blinked hard. For a second, he wasn't in the courtroom. He was in Iraq. The smell of burnt fuel in the air. Dust caked in his throat. Gunfire ringing in his ears. And Tom Young, brave, cursing under his breath as Samuel dragged him across the open field. He hadn't remembered her face from those photos, but now he saw it. Judge Whitaker continued. 20 years ago, my brother wrote home about a man who saved his life. A sergeant who charged into enemy fire to pull him out. A man who then held the line alone while the rest of his unit evacuated the wounded. Her voice softened. That man was Staff Sergeant Samuel Morgan. A slow movement rippled through the room. The older Army veteran from earlier stepped forward again. I saw it, he said. I saw him take 2 bullets and keep going. Told us to run. We wouldn't have survived if he hadn't stood between us and hell. Whitaker gave a small nod but kept her focus on Samuel. 2 weeks after my brother sent that letter, he was killed by an IED. At his funeral, many spoke of his courage. But they also spoke of you. The man who gave us 2 more weeks with him. Time we never would have had. She paused, then stood from the bench. I tried to find you after that. The Army said you'd redeployed. Then discharged. And then, nothing. You disappeared. Samuel didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat had closed around every word he had never let himself say. But his eyes said it all. Years of silence. Of guilt. Of wondering if saving Thomas Whitaker had even mattered. I never stopped searching, she continued, her voice breaking gently. And now, 20 years later, you walk into my courtroom. Not as a hero. Not as a decorated veteran. But as a man accused of trying to stay warm. She motioned to the colonel. This is Colonel James Hastings. He was my brother's commanding officer. He has something to present. Colonel Hastings stepped forward with solemn precision. Staff Sergeant Samuel Morgan, he began, voice rich and commanding, we've been looking for you. He gestured to the corporal, who opened the wooden case. Inside, resting on deep blue velvet, was a medal, its silver cross gleaming against the velvet's richness. The courtroom gasped as the colonel announced. By order of the Secretary of the Army, in recognition of extraordinary bravery and valor beyond the call of duty on April 17, 2004, the Distinguished Service Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Samuel T. Morgan, United States Army. Even the prosecutor stood in disbelief. Colonel Hastings continued, until recently, details of your engagement were classified. Your Silver Star has now been formally upgraded. Our internal review confirmed that your actions disrupted an ambush that would have eliminated an entire convoy. You didn't just save one officer. You saved over 24 soldiers that day. Samuel stared at the medal as if it belonged to someone else. There must be some mistake, he whispered. No mistake, the colonel said with steady conviction. This is long overdue. From the gallery, the Army veteran called out once more, attention on deck. One by one, men and women stood. Some in uniform. Some in plain clothes. A few wore battered pins. Others had nothing but tears. They all stood. And they saluted. Not for the courtroom. Not for the judge. But for him. For the man who had once bled quietly and disappeared into a world that forgot him. For the man who stood now, finally seen. Judge Whitaker tried to speak, but her voice trembled. She wiped her eyes quickly and regained composure. In light of these extraordinary revelations, she said, her voice thick with emotion, all charges against Staff Sergeant Samuel Morgan are hereby dismissed. The gavel came down not with judgment, but with justice. The courtroom exhaled. The weight that had sat heavy on Samuel's shoulders for 2 decades began to lift. But it wasn't over. As the room began to settle, a staff sergeant from the Department of Veterans Affairs approached with a tablet in hand. Sir, he said respectfully, we've located your VA file. Under the Veterans Review Act, your benefits have now been fully reassessed. You're officially listed as 100% service-connected. Samuel blinked. What does that mean? It means, the staff sergeant explained, you're entitled to full back pay. Retroactive to 2002. Complete medical care, housing assistance, and any educational or mental health support you may need. Ethan Caldwell stepped in firmly. Our firm will ensure every single benefit is processed, no more delays, no more lost paperwork. Before Samuel could answer, another man stepped forward. It was Jimmy, the line cook from Roosevelt Diner. He'd been standing in the back, silent, tears running down his face. My father used to tell me stories, Jimmy said quietly, walking slowly forward. He served in Desert Storm. He told me that if I ever met a man named Samuel Morgan, I owed him everything. He extended a trembling hand. I never knew that man was you. Not until today. Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he took the hand, his grip firm, his eyes wet. From behind the prosecution table, Assistant D.A. Yates stood, guilt washing over him like a wave. I had no idea, he stammered. Sir, please accept my apology. I treated you like a criminal when I should have treated you like a human being. Samuel offered a faint smile. You did what you were taught, he said. Now you know different. And then, slowly, the room emptied. But not the way courtrooms usually do. People lingered, spoke softly, shook Samuel's hand. Some left quietly, looking thoughtful. Others, with tearful eyes, embraced him. In that moment, he wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just a name in a file or a man behind a citation. He was remembered. Seen. Respected. And for the first time in 20 years, Samuel Morgan no longer felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a world that moved on without him. Later that same afternoon, the courthouse slowly emptied, leaving behind only a whisper of what had happened within its walls. But for Samuel Morgan, time hadn't resumed. It had fractured. He stepped outside onto the steps of the courthouse, the winter sunlight soft and cool against his skin. The same hands that had once held rifles, built bridges, and lifted men from fire now trembled slightly in the open air. But for once, they weren't shaking from cold or hunger. They were shaking from being remembered. Ethan Caldwell walked beside him, not like an attorney, but like an old friend who just watched history tilt itself back into place. "You okay?" Ethan asked, offering a warm smile. Samuel looked at the sky. "I'm not sure yet. Feels like I'm walking in someone else's story." "You are," Ethan said. "But now it's yours again." They didn't say much more as they walked down the steps. A black SUV from the VA awaited them, part of the Emergency Housing Initiative. The doors opened, and for the first time in 2 decades, Samuel sat in a vehicle meant not to transport him away, but to bring him home. 2 weeks later. The hallway was quiet, the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. Light from the window spilled into the small apartment unit 204. It wasn't grand. But it was clean, warm, and his. The walls were bare, except for a single new frame. Inside it, the Distinguished Service Cross, flanked by 2 Purple Hearts, a bronze star, and a faded photo of a younger Samuel Morgan standing in full dress uniform, his wife and daughter beside him. Ethan had tracked it all down. The medals had been recovered from a storage unit in Tulsa, auctioned off years ago. No one had claimed them because no one knew who to return them to. Until now. Samuel adjusted the medals slowly, lining them with military precision. Then, a soft knock at the door. He opened it and found Judge Marlene Whitaker standing there, not in her robe, not in black heels of authority, but in a simple coat and scarf, holding a small wooden box. "May I come in, Sergeant Morgan?" she asked gently. He gave a faint smile. "Just Samuel, now." She returned it. "Then just Marlene." Inside, the apartment was humble, with only a table, a small couch, and a chair. She sat across from him, the quiet between them more comforting than awkward. "I brought something," she said, setting the box on the table. Inside was a bundle of old letters, carefully tied with a navy ribbon. "They're from my brother. He wrote to us every week while he was deployed." Samuel stared at them as if she had placed a piece of his soul on the table. "This one," Marlene said, handing him a specific envelope, "was written the day after you saved him." His fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was clear, deliberate. "Mom, Dad, Marlene. Don't believe everything you hear in the news. We're okay. Yesterday, we got ambushed. Hard. If it wasn't for one of our NCO's staff, Sergeant Morgan, I wouldn't be writing this right now. He ran through open fire like it didn't exist. Pulled me out, even when I told him to leave me. He just said, 'Not on my watch. No man gets left behind.' I've never seen courage like that. He reminds me why I became an officer." Samuel couldn't finish reading. His voice broke in the middle. He looked up, eyes swimming. "I always wondered if I'd done the right thing, saving him." Marlene nodded. "He volunteered for the mission that cost him his life. Said he wanted to lead by example. He said he wanted to live up to you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. "He was a good officer," Samuel said finally. "Still young, but he gave a damn about his people. That's rare." Marlene smiled softly. "He talked about you all the time. Said you were the kind of man who didn't need medals to be a leader." She glanced around the apartment. "After he died, I went to law school. The Veterans Court, the housing programs, the outreach. They all came from reading his letters, his stories about soldiers who came home to nothing." Samuel swallowed hard. "I'm not a hero, Marlene. I just did what needed doing." "And that," she replied quietly, "is exactly what heroes always say." She rose, walking to the window, looking out at the snow beginning to fall again, light, delicate, silent. "There's one more thing you should know," she added. "The day my brother died, he wasn't just on patrol. He was leading a mission to stop insurgents from targeting civilian aid routes. He volunteered. Said he wanted to be the man you believed he could be. Those words struck harder than any bullet Samuel had ever taken. For 20 years, he'd walked with that doubt. The aching question, had he only delayed a tragedy? Had his effort been meaningless? But now, here was the answer. He didn't die because of you, Marlene said gently. He lived the way he did because of you. Samuel looked down at the medals, then at the letter in his hands. Slowly, something long buried began to lift from his chest. Most days, he whispered, I thought no one remembered. Like it never mattered. Like none of it mattered. She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and real. It did, Samuel. To him. To the men you saved. To every one of us who now get to correct what should have never been forgotten. She started to leave, then turned back. My brother used to say the measure of a soldier isn't what he does in front of a crowd. It's what he does when no one's watching. She met his eyes one last time. You lived that. Samuel nodded slowly. After all this time, someone remembered my name. Marlene smiled. We're just getting started. As she left, Samuel sat back in his chair, snow still falling beyond the window. The cold didn't scare him anymore. For the first time in decades, he wasn't surviving. He was home. And the name Samuel Morgan, once buried beneath years of silence, was alive again. The morning sun filtered gently through the blinds of Unit 204, touching the old wooden frame on Samuel's wall. The metals shimmered faintly. They no longer felt like reminders of the past, they felt like markers of a life rediscovered. Samuel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of a clean shirt. It had been years since he'd owned anything without holes, anything that fit. His reflection stared back, older, certainly, but steadier. There was a quiet in his eyes now. Not emptiness, peace. There was a knock at the door. This time, it wasn't a judge or a lawyer. It was a man in a black vest, clipboard in hand, standing beside a large moving truck. Mr. Morgan, he asked. We've got your furniture. VA Housing Support sent us. Everything's been approved. Samuel blinked. Furniture. The man smiled. Couch, table, bed, hell, we even threw in a recliner. My uncle served in Iraq. Said we don't let guys like you sleep on the floor anymore. Samuel stepped aside, watching the crew carry in what he once thought he'd never see again, a home taking shape. Within the hour, his apartment looked lived in. Lived in and loved. Later that day, Ethan Caldwell arrived with a folder in hand and purpose in his step. Your retroactive VA pay came through, he said. Full back pay. Benefits. Medical care. Housing. Everything. He handed over the folder. It's all yours now. Samuel opened it slowly. Inside were numbers he never imagined would have his name beside them. Enough to breathe. Enough to live. Enough to never freeze behind a diner again. He looked up. Why'd you help me? Ethan paused. Because I owed someone, he said quietly. Back when I was a cocky law clerk, I got into trouble bad. Your name didn't come up then, but someone told me a story. A story about a man who'd pulled 6 soldiers from gunfire and never asked for recognition. That story stuck with me. Made me change. He smiled faintly. Turns out that story was about you. Samuel didn't respond with words. He just reached out, and they shook hands like men who understood something the rest of the world often missed: honor has no expiration date. As evening came, the phone rang. Samuel answered it hesitantly. Mr. Morgan, a soft voice spoke. It's Denise Harper. I'm with the local Veterans Alliance. We've heard your story. Would you consider speaking at our high school assembly next month? Some of the kids, they need to know men like you exist. Samuel chuckled lightly. I'm not much of a speaker. That's okay, she said. You already said everything just by surviving. He agreed. 3 weeks passed. The city moved on, as it always did. Headlines faded. Courtrooms filled with new cases. But within a small corner of Springfield, something had changed. The Roosevelt Diner, once the backdrop of Samuel's arrest, was now different too. One morning, Samuel stepped back into its alley, not to warm himself but to find Jimmy, the cook, hanging a small plaque on the brick wall. It read, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Samuel T. Morgan, for reminding us that dignity doesn't disappear with age, and heroism doesn't need a witness." When Samuel approached, Jimmy turned, eyes glassy. "I wanted them to know," he said. Samuel nodded. "You didn't owe me anything." "No," Jimmy replied. "But I owed my father. And he owed you. That makes it mine, too." Inside, the diner had set aside a table near the window, Sam's spot, they called it. Free meals, every time. Not because of pity. But respect. The same people who once walked past him without looking now tipped their hats, held doors open, stopped to talk. They saw him. At the next city council meeting, Judge Whitaker stood before the board with an official proposal. "Today, I'm submitting legislation to name the new Veteran Housing Initiative after Sergeant Morgan," she said. "The Morgan Center will serve as a reminder of what happens when we choose to see the invisible, to hear the silenced, to lift the fallen." The motion passed unanimously. That same night, in a local news feature, her final words echoed across Springfield, "Some heroes save lives. And then spend a lifetime waiting for someone to save theirs. It's time we stopped waiting." One last moment. In a room at the Morgan Center, dimly lit by a small bedside lamp, Samuel sat in a chair beside a young veteran 26, discharged recently, still trembling from the weight of war. The young man stared at the wall, silent. "I know what it feels like," Samuel said softly. "To think no one's coming." The young man didn't look at him, but his breathing calmed slightly. Samuel continued, "I waited a long time. Too long. But someone remembered me." He paused, then added, "And I'll remember you. Every single one of you." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, white, and quiet. This time, it didn't feel like cold. It felt like peace. The snow kept falling long after midnight, wrapping the city in a hush that softened even the harshest corners of Springfield. Lights from the Morgan Center glowed dim but steady, like beacons in the dark. Inside, Samuel Morgan sat at his desk, hands folded, a cup of black coffee cooling slowly beside him. It had been exactly 6 weeks since the courtroom stood in silent awe, saluting a man it had nearly condemned. And yet, in this quiet hour, Samuel didn't feel triumphant. He felt something deeper. Whole. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't surviving on instinct. He wasn't begging for warmth. He wasn't trying to explain away his presence in alleys or shelters or behind exhaust vents. He belonged somewhere. And somewhere finally belonged to him. That morning, he dressed carefully, not in a uniform, but in the best version of himself, dark slacks, a wool coat gifted to him by the city, a scarf handwoven by a retired nurse at the shelter. On his lapel, pinned neatly, was the Distinguished Service Cross, not for pride, but so others would ask. And they did. The high school auditorium was filled wall to wall. Teenagers. Teachers. Local press. Veterans with folded arms and damp eyes. They had come for the ceremony, of course, the naming of the center. But they stayed for the man. Samuel walked onto the stage with a slow, deliberate gait. No music. No fanfare. Just presence. He stood before the microphone. Adjusted it once. Twice. Then, his voice filled the air. "When I came home, I didn't come home all the way." Silence. "I walked into airports where no one met me. Slept on benches under flags I once saluted. I wore medals in my coat pocket, but not once on my chest. Because they didn't feed me. They didn't give me a bed. He looked around the room. Most folks didn't see me. Some looked through me. A few looked down at me. He paused. But every single day, I remembered the ones who didn't make it back. The ones I carried. The ones who carried me. I remembered them, even when no one remembered me. In the front row, Judge Whitaker sat silently, her eyes fixed on him. And then one day, Samuel continued, I walked into a courtroom expecting handcuffs, and I walked out with my name returned to me. He motioned to the crowd. I don't speak here today because I was brave. I speak here because someone chose to remember. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. Some of you are too young to understand what war takes. Some of you may never serve. But let me tell you this, whether in uniform or in silence, everyone you walk past has a story. And sometimes, the ones who look forgotten, were the ones who held the line when no one else would. The room rose in a slow, rolling standing ovation, not out of obligation, but out of something raw. Something awakened. They weren't applauding what Samuel had done. They were applauding what he had survived. Later that evening, back at the Morgan Center, Samuel walked the quiet halls. He stopped by room 103, where a young woman, Marine Corps, was reading alone. She looked up and gave him a tired smile. You good? He asked. She nodded. Trying. He gave her a small nod. That's more than enough. Room 106 housed a former Army medic who rarely spoke but left thank you notes folded in the rec room. Room 111 held a man who used to scream in his sleep but lately, slept through the night. Samuel wasn't just a resident anymore. He was the heartbeat of the place. Back in his room, he sat again beneath his wall of medals. But this time, his eyes drifted to a smaller frame, one that held the letter from Captain Thomas Whitaker. Not on my watch. No man gets left behind. He read the words silently, mouthing them with reverence. A soft knock came at the door. Marlene stepped inside, this time not as a judge, but as the sister of a man long gone and a friend of the one who brought him home. I wanted to say goodbye before I left, she said. I'm taking a break. A few months off the bench. First time in 20 years. Samuel smiled gently. Hard to let go of the fight, isn't it? It is, she said, laughing lightly. But I learned something from watching you. What's that? That the fight doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes, it's just choosing to stay. They sat in silence for a while. No need for more words. When she stood to leave, she turned back. You changed more than a courtroom, Sam. You changed all of us. After she left, he returned to the window, where snow was once again beginning to fall. Not harsh. Not bitter. Soft. Like a memory returned. 1 year later. The Morgan Center had grown. Expanded. The waiting list stretched across counties. Veterans were no longer statistics on dusty ledgers. They were here. Living. Recovering. Leading. Samuel Morgan still lived in Unit 204. He never moved. He said he wanted to remember where healing had begun. He now worked part-time as a peer counselor. Some days, he walked the halls offering no more than a smile and a nod. Other days, he sat for hours with those on the brink, reminding them gently, always gently, that the war wasn't the end. One afternoon, a young soldier stopped him. You're Sergeant Morgan, right? Samuel nodded. My father said you saved his life in Fallujah. Samuel paused. What was his name? Gonzalez. Corporal Mark Gonzalez. Samuel smiled faintly. Took shrapnel in the shoulder. Stubborn as hell. The young man laughed. That's him. They shook hands, and the circle tightened. Another name remembered. Another legacy reconnected. That night, as Samuel returned to his room, he lit a candle on the windowsill. He didn't always talk about what had happened. But he always remembered. And now, finally, the world did too. He whispered into the still air, barely audible. Thank you for coming back for me. Because some heroes never stop fighting. And some promises, no matter how long it takes, are always kept. This story reminds us that true honor doesn't fade with time, poverty, or silence. Heroes don't always wear uniforms forever, and sometimes, the bravest among us are the ones we forget the fastest. But dignity isn't something you earn once, it's something you carry, even when the world refuses to see it. Let this be a reminder: before you judge someone by where they are now, try to understand where they've been. Because the man you ignore today might just be the reason you're free to walk away. Thank you so much for watching this powerful story. If it moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world a little differently, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. Because sometimes, a single story can change everything.